United we're as strong as a mountain.
This is Steve Zeltzer, and I'm with Workweek, and I'm with David Van Deusen, who's president of the Vermont AFL-CIO, and has been pretty forthright about the need for change in the labor movement within the AFL-CIO and about mobilizing the labor movement independently, and also about the threat of the rise of fascism in the United States. So welcome to our show, David.
Always glad to join you, Steve.
So David, maybe you can talk about some of the developments facing labor. We talked earlier about the railroad bill signed by both Biden, the Democrats and Republicans, that order railroad workers back to work without sick days. Their continuing attacks on unions, their upcoming struggles of the UPS workers and auto workers whose contracts are coming up, and the need for mobilization for United Front for mobilizing the workers is critical. So what is the situation facing workers in 2023 that you see are essential?
I would say that the recent elections of progressive reform candidates and reform slates into various offices in the labor movement is a huge thing. Like we're talking about O'Brien and Teamsters for Democratic Union winning elections recently to head that international. Then we have Fain and that reform slate in the UAW, United for Democracy, sweeping or largely winning elections within recent months and weeks. That's a huge thing. Coupled with the fact that we have very good progressive leadership in APWU with Mark Diamondstein as president, of course, the Flight Attendants Union with Sarah Nelson, and a number of more progressive state and local labor councils across the country, I see labor turning to the working class left. In my mind, that's a direction we've needed to turn to for many decades and haven't. We need to create a departure of ourselves in our politics from the old school way of thinking where we're going to put our eggs in the basket of the Democratic Party. We have to get to the place where we're not afraid to organize, we're not afraid to strike, we're not afraid to exercise our power. In order to do that, we're going to have to see changes both at the local level, the state level, and at the international level. And we're starting to see that now, and that makes me optimistic.
And you're going to be attending a conference in Los Angeles, I understand, around a possible work to form a labor party. The union is a big supporter of the Democrats in the United States. They give them millions and millions of dollars. They supported the Democratic leadership, Nancy Pelosi, and they have a bipartisan policy on war and the expansion of the war. How do you see a political development of labor, an independent political party of labor developing in the United States? There was the Labor Party led by Mazzocchi that was formed. How do you see this taking place?
Well, unfortunately, it seems to start and stop in fits, right? There has been historic efforts to create our own party. Now, I think that here in Vermont, I'm proud of the fact that we've gotten behind the Democratic Socialist Vermont Progressive Party in a number of election cycles in a row now, helping them win major office, including the lieutenant governorship in the last election. That's the type of action we're going to need to see on a larger scale with resources put into building an alternative to the Democrats and Republicans. One thing that's becoming increasingly clear to union members, rank and file, is the National Democratic Party, by and large, does not stand with us, right? The betrayal of rail workers highlights this. The fact that they were forced to go back to work, had an agreement imposed upon them, essentially by Democratic Party leadership and Joe Biden. It's impossible to say anything other than the fact that they sold this out to their corporate backers. And we see this time and again for year after year after year. And so the rank and file isn't fooled. But the leadership still feels cozy, still feels good about their close personal relationships and what they believe to be proximity to power, not real power, but proximity to it. And we have to break the leadership from that, I don't want to say tradition, we have to break the leadership from that false notion of it's in our best interest to build the Democratic Party because they're less fascistic. Perhaps they're less regressive than aspects of the Republican Party.
And one of the major issues facing workers is attack through privatization of public services and also privatization of Medicare with Medicare Advantage. In New York, there's a struggle against the effort to get rid of their public health care and force workers into Medicare Advantage, whether they want it or not. And their union officials who were voted to get rid of Medicare and also on boards of insurance companies, Blue Cross and others in the unions. What do you think about this whole fight around the issue of healthcare and privatization of healthcare, which is being pushed by Democrats and Republicans through Medicare Advantage and other cutbacks?
Well, look, the Vermont AFL-CIO is part of a member of Labor for Single Payer. So in my mind, there's no doubt that what we need to be fighting for is not just single payer, but the step beyond for a nationalized, rational healthcare system where healthcare is a human right and not something that one gets if they can afford it, not somebody that one gets just because of their union contract. There's no doubt that absolutely that has to happen, and we have to mobilize towards that end. But when we talk about the Advantage program or the Disadvantage program, I haven't had any direct conversations with union officials out of New York City or New York, but I can tell you this, here in Vermont, our governor, who's a moderate Republican, has been pushing that as well for retired state employees. State employees here are part of an independent union called, and retirees in a sense, called the Vermont State Employee Association. VSEA has been fighting back hard, bringing political pressure to bear to defeat this politically in our capital, Montpelier, and they've been having success, and I believe they will win that fight, and we stand in solidarity with them. There is no scenario ever where we should take a public good, something that works, and hand it to the capitalist class to make profit off of. Profit does not serve the interests of the individual. Profit is grown when claims are denied. Profit is grown when services are diminished or denied. So I would caution that no labor leader should believe whatever bull the capitalists and politicians are trying to sell them. When it comes to a public good, it needs to stay in the public realm. It needs to be publicly managed, publicly owned, and a public right.
The issue of the money that's going to the war in Ukraine, the military budget is reaching nearly $1 trillion, the largest budget in the world. There are over 800 bases. There's AUKUS, the Australian-US British military agreement that is being proposed, including a base in a new nuclear base in Australia that they're having. There's going to be a rally on May 6th against it. Is there an organized effort to rally the US labor movement to oppose militarization and encirclement of China and more bases around the world with the possible world war?
The increasing escalation of the war in the Ukraine is of great concern to me. Our state labor council presently has not taken a position per se on the war. So I'm going to speak for myself here. Many things concern me, but before we get to that, I also want to make clear that I think what Russia has done is terrible. I don't think they were justified in invading the Ukraine. And I'm also not going to pretend that they are somehow a progressive force in the world or in Russia itself. But we have to look at some of the realities here. Russia is a nuclear power. Everybody knows that. They have more nuclear weapons than any other nation on the planet other than the United States. And as that conflict gets escalated, and it is a proxy war, if Western, NATO, and American guns and ammunition stop flowing to that conflict zone, the war would be over within a week. We are absolutely, our equipment, our supplies, our money, our tax dollars are supporting that conflict. And as we do, the danger grows. And the danger for that conflict to grow outside the borders of Ukraine becomes frankly frightening. Now, when we are going to risk, or if we're ever going to risk a nuclear conflict or world war, or war between large nations with millions and tens of millions of lives at stake, if not more, we have to say, well, who are we defending exactly, right? What is the context in which this risk is taken? And as much as the Russians may overstate the control or influence of Nazis, literally, within the Ukrainian government, the fact remains that since the fall of Franco, the only nation on the planet with actual fascists and Nazis organized as independent units that identify as such, as neo-fascists, within their armed forces is the country of Ukraine. And since 2014, hundreds of monuments have gone up across that country in honor of those Nazis, Ukrainian Nazis, that played a hand in the death of hundreds of thousands of Jewish people during the Holocaust. Now, the Zelensky government, time and time again, has had a chance to step away from groups like Azov, which are Nazis, to create a division between those on the hard right, the dangerous hard right within their country, and the regular military forces. And instead of doing that, he has propped them up as heroes of the state. He is now integrating the Azov battalion, which are Nazis, into a broader stormtrooper unit tasked with retaking Russian-held territory. Stormtrooper unit. And these folks in Azov wear Nazi emblems. So when I look at two large right-wing countries that are at war with each other, one larger than the other, one more resources than the other, and Russia, of course, was the one that escalated the conflict that was already in the Donbass. But when I look at that, I'm not willing to give my money and my blood and my children's lives to defend folks that think it's okay to have relationships on a national scale, a government to armed forces relationship with actual Nazis. I don't think this is our fight. If we want to talk about a progressive struggle where there's an armed conflict, if we want to look at Rojava in northern Syria, sure, let's have that conversation. That's a good conversation to have. But I'm not willing to have risk nuclear war to defend folks that think it's okay to play nice and praise and name streets after and build monuments to the Nazis.
And it's a bipartisan policy, the Democrats and Republicans. And by the way, there was a vote in Congress to keep U.S. troops in Syria, where we're also have an oil field and are getting oil.
That issue is more complex, though. I'd be happy to talk about that issue, but to me, that one is much more nuanced than what we see in the Ukraine.
The AFL-CIO Solidarity Center is funded by the U.S. government, the National Endowment for Democracy, $75 million a year. The AFL-CIO was involved in Ukraine democracy efforts and supporting candidates who were in favor of privatization in Ukraine. This year is the 50th anniversary of U.S.-supported coup in Chile that overturned the government, cost the lives of thousands of trade union workers and their families. It was supported by the CIA and the AFL-CIO, that coup, and there have been other coups around the world that the AFL-CIO has been involved in through the Solidarity Center. Where do you see this going, and particularly accountability, since most workers are unaware, and particularly workers in the AFL-CIO and CWA, all the different unions, UAW, that the AFL-CIO's international arm is being financed by the U.S. government, and its record is covered up, and its history is one of intervention to support corporate unions, and in the case of Ukraine, actually supporting quote-unquote labor candidates who are in favor of privatization and working with oligarchs, right-wing European oligarchs.
Look, we have a checkered history for sure. The labor movement in this country has built things like the weekend. The labor movement in this country has lifted more people out of poverty than any other social force in the United States of America. But the conservative elements of the labor movement, which have essentially been in power in many internationals and with the National AFL-CIO, largely, not always, but largely since the 1950s, have got in bed with the wrong characters at different times. Now, if we're going to build a movement to really challenge the billionaire class, the rich, the powerful, the elite, those that don't want your kids to be able to have the rights or the resources that we know as workers that they need to have, those that would rather take that money, such as like resources for free college tuition, and put that in their bank accounts or pay it back to their shareholders, those folks are not the ones that we should be taking money from with strings attached and designing policy around. What we need to do is build international solidarity with unions all across the globe, working people all across the globe, to not just try to break the chain of oppression and capitalism and the billionaires here in the United States, but at many links all around the world, because that's the only way we're going to beat it. Capital is international, and therefore labor and the labor movement has to be international too. We need a labor foreign policy which is squarely anti-imperialist, which is squarely for the liberation of workers and the empowerment of workers all around the world. And we need to be unafraid to send resources to those places where they're engaged in struggle. Now, when we talk about receiving essentially government money to prop up conservative or right-wing or non-labor-centric policies around the globe, that needs to stop. And we shouldn't take a penny where there's strings attached. That's all to it. That's just the right thing to do. But right now, I think it's very important that we talk the truth, that we publicly speak out on such issues, and we talk with the rank and file about what's in our interests internationally. Because I'll tell you what, the average machinist, the average construction worker, the average nurse, they're not looking into the books and saying, well, hey, what is the AFL-CIO engaged in Colombia? What is the AFL-CIO engaged in Venezuela, right? It's the furthest thing from their mind. I mean, hell, it would be a leap if the 12.5 million members of the AFL-CIO across the country, as a starting point, understood squarely what the AFL-CIO is and what it has the potential to do as far as a vehicle for change goes. But certainly, they're not thinking about the Solidarity Center and things like this. So that's something that we need to bring to folks as a discussion, because we need to model ourselves as an internal labor democracy to our conventions, to our members, at union meetings, to build awareness. A lot of folks don't even know that we have what amounts to a foreign policy, right, as a national labor movement. So why don't we start with there and remind folks that the labor movement's actually there to be the embodiment and articulation of their desires, their beliefs, their goals. And then let's further hammer home that any international stances we take need to uphold and reflect those values that they have as a group, as a collective, as workers.
And you have the issue of the Palestinian workers and the kind of attacks that they've been facing, Palestinian people, apartheid conditions. The AFL-CIO has supported the Histadrut and also in labor councils and union bodies around the country, exerted pressure to say you can't even discuss the relationship of the AFL-CIO to Israel and support of Israel. That you think that should come up in the AFL-CIO as well? Is the issue of democracy to even debate these issues? I know in the San Francisco Labor Council, Los Angeles unions, the Zionists actually organized to prevent even a discussion, and the leadership said we can't even talk about these issues.
Well, that's absurd. We, as the Vermont AFL-CIO, have spoken out publicly in support and in solidarity of the Palestinian workers. And we're happy to speak out about any international group of workers that are rising up for their rights, right, that are trying to defend themselves. We need to change the bylaws of the National AFL-CIO. We need to change the Constitution. We tried unsuccessfully, the Vermont AFL-CIO, to bring certain resolutions to the table last summer at the National AFL-CIO convention, and that fight's not over with. That was the beginning of a larger conversation about democratizing the labor movement. Like, look, I'm loyal to the AFL-CIO. I know that this could be a mass vehicle for change. I know the potential there, and I'm proud to be a union member. I'm proud to be an AFL-CIO member, but that doesn't mean we aren't wrong about certain things. And we inherited an archaic governing constitution that provides that only 500 or so delegates end up electing the national officers. That's absurd. There's a reason why the UAW rank and file members, through their pressure, changed their bylaws or changed their method of elections to allow members themselves to elect their officers. And when that happened, no surprise, Fain was elected president, a progressive left-wing working class leader who came to the scene to challenge the old guard. And what we need to do with the AFL-CIO is we have to return to a notion that we need true democracy, not some sort of Politburo who makes decisions for us. And for us to do that, we have to go to a one member, one vote. I'll say that to anybody that asks, and I know that to a person, every single conversation I have with a rank and file member in Vermont, they agree with us on this. So the fight for that continues. But when it comes to CLCs, Central Labor Councils, and state labor federations, I think that they should be encouraged to debate the hard issues of the day. I think they should be encouraged to articulate positions on difficult issues that impact working people, not just in the United States, but around the globe. And in that way, through that experimentation, through that debate, it will be easier for us to come to a national consensus on a more progressive way to look at international politics. That's my opinion, and I'm more than happy, and I know that the United Slate, which is in office here in Vermont, agrees that those are the type of things we need to fight for within labor, loyally within labor, to make happen, to give rank and file members more of a voice.
And one other international issue, and it affects the UAW in their negotiations at the auto companies, is what's going on in Mexico. Because the United States has built a large production of not only automobile production, but also parts plants in Mexico. And the United States supported NAFTA, which privatized large plots of land and industry in Mexico, and USMCA, which was supported by Trump and former president of the AFL-CIO, Richard Trumka. And now the United States, the Solidarity Center and USAID and the State Department are spending $300 million a year in Mexico to reform, quote unquote, reform the Mexican labor movement. And I would argue bring in American style unions into Mexico. What's your view about US intervention in Mexico and what's going on there? Since $300 million, the budget of the NLRB in the United States is $279 million.
Look,
And we're spending $300 million in Mexico for labor reform.
Look, I want to be clear that I haven't been briefed on the AFL-CIO's involvement in the Mexican labor movement, but I can speak from personal experience. So some years ago, I had the pleasure of traveling throughout Mexico for some length of time, an old pickup truck, actually, where I spent some time in Chiapas, in rebel-held territory with the Zapatistas. And as part of those travels, more north, on my way back towards the United States, on the Gulf Coast area, I spent a night at a home of a union member who was a longshoreman. And while we were talking, he was a union member, a local union, Mexican union down there. He was making pennies on the dollar that his union brothers and sisters are making for the same labor out on the West Coast today. And we had a discussion about that. And the union that he was a member of was a quote unquote government union. It was corrupt to the core. And it certainly didn't seem like it was fighting for the interests of their members. And the fact that he was barely, he had a modest apartment, a 2-bedroom apartment, lived with his son. His son was a union member too, but only worked here and there on an on-call basis. And through our conversations, it was clear to me that there were serious problems with the Mexican unions and or at least the union he was in. So I don't doubt that the labor movement in Mexico, just like the United States, needs reforming and needs change and needs to be more rank and file driven. I don't doubt that. Now, if the United States government policy is to try to turn any impetus towards labor reform into something that's more business friendly, then that needs to be resisted and that needs to be known about. If the efforts of the National AFL-CIO are to help make them more into fighting unions that are not connected with old political parties like the PRI, then I would support that. But the fact is that all unions need to be led and driven by the rank and file. They need to be democratic and they need to be unafraid to strike. They need to be unafraid to do what they need to do to not just build better working conditions and better standards of living for those members, but also to exert political power and influence over society as a whole.
And we have in Europe and around the world a growing strike wave, general strikes of workers. And in France, there's a mass movement against extending the retirement age that the workers are fighting the Macron government about. These general strikes seem like very different from what's going on in the United States as far as uniting workers here, all union people, communities. How do you see the strike movement in France and Greece against privatization of the railways? There seems to be a growing strike wave worldwide, yet there doesn't seem to be any action to build that kind of movement in the United States to tie these struggles together, privatization of Social Security, of education, and the attack on workers throughout the United States.
Well, first of all, solidarity with the workers and the people all throughout France, that have been engaging in a rolling general strike for some time now, and who aren't taking shit when it comes to the conservative government's attempts to roll back their retirement benefits. They're doing what needs to be done. And the fact that they're not taking guff from the government, they're not backing down, and they're unafraid to combat physically, if need be, the powers of capital. They're doing the right thing. But here's the interesting thing about France. Their union density is similar to the United States. They have maybe 10%, give or take, maybe a little more union density, about the same as the United States as a whole. But their unions have something that we have not built yet in America. They have moral authority among workers. So when the unions announce that they're going on strike and they're going to shut down the country, millions and millions and millions of French men and women follow and also don't go to work and shut down the streets and do what needs to be done to occupy buildings and to fight back when they're attacked in order to make their voice heard, in order to change the politics of that government. France has a long history of that. I mean, we could go back to the French Revolution if we really wanted to talk about the French history of workers being involved in mass social change in that country. So
or the Paris Commune.
Or the Paris Commune of 1871. Absolutely. So I'm absolutely impressed by the French. I stand in absolute solidarity with the French people. And that's the kind of moral authority we need to build through our labor unions here with the working class in the United States. But we don't do that just talking about getting another 25 cents an hour or a COLA that matches inflation with our union contracts. We have to go beyond that. We have to do that bread and butter stuff, and we have to do it very well. Okay, don't get me wrong, but we have to go beyond that, and we have to talk about those broader social issues like livable wages for everybody, like just cause job protections for everybody, like the right to organize for everybody, like universal single-payer healthcare and beyond for everybody. And in that way, as working people see us standing up for all the working class, then we could become that moral voice too. But if we're going to talk about Paris and the Paris Commune in 1871, I think it's also behooves us to go back and at least have some dialogue on what's going on in Rojava now in northern Syria. If that area of Syria was in Europe, it would be front page of every newspaper every day. There are unions and workers and armed revolutionaries on a daily basis fighting like hell for establishing a more equitable direct democracy in that area of Syria. And they've managed to win by force of arms a version of autonomy within that geographical area, despite mass attacks and bombings, aerial bombings and artillery and invasions from Turkey, despite still having to combat ISIS within their own borders. And the type of fight and the ideological, political, and democratic goals of that revolution, that society, frankly, are akin to what we saw in Spain in 1936. Yet the Western media doesn't whisper a word about it because it doesn't fit. First of all, it doesn't fit their narrative, and it's secular. I should mention that too, and very much is actively in support of women's rights. And it's not European, right? So, or American, so it gets ignored. But that can't be ignored. That is, frankly, one of the most foundational revolutions going on within our lifetimes, and it's unfolding right now as we speak in northern Syria.
And one of the important issues is the development of China's export of capital through the Belt and Road, BRICS project in South Africa, Latin America, and Asia. It's the largest exporter of capital in the world now, and building projects internationally. The issue of Chinese capital, both public and private, in Africa is an important one and growing one. In Namibia, the leadership of the Rossi mine, uranium mine, have been fired. Other mine union leaders have been fired in Namibia. How do you see Chinese capital investment around the world and the role of workers in the fight to defend workers who work for companies owned or controlled by Chinese capital?
Look, China could call itself what it will. Maybe it's striving towards socialism. Maybe it isn't. Maybe it's irredeemably state capitalist at this point. I don't know. But it doesn't matter, because when you're a worker, when you're working class, It doesn't matter who the exploiter is, who the oppressor is, you know who they are. And wherever that capital is, wherever that force is that tries to make you not get what you need for you and your family, they need to be resisted. It doesn't matter if it's Kronstadt. It doesn't matter if it's has to do with China. Our job as working class people is to get what's ours. And furthermore, to band together to get what's ours for all of the working class. And if China stands in the way of that, they must be resisted too.
There has been a growth of young people in the United States who are looking at history. Do you think that's going to be continuing in the United States as far as the working class young workers, particularly becoming politically developed and looking at the history of the working class, the history of the commune, which very few people are familiar with, the history even of the U.S. working class, the general strike in 1877 in St. Louis, where a commune was set up. It seems like the American history itself has tremendous lessons of struggle and unity. I mean, there was a general strike in New Orleans in 1872. So it's a rich history in the United States that many workers are unaware of.
All we have to do is look at the last two presidential cycles. And we used to talk about how amazing it was, I believe it was in 1920, give or take, that Eugene Debs as a socialist got almost 1 million votes for president. Bernie Sanders, who identified himself publicly as a democratic socialist, got millions and millions and millions of votes, frankly, at various points, threatening to win the Democratic primary for president of the United States. He openly campaigned as a socialist. Now, some folks on the further left might say, well, he's not socialist enough. But I'll tell you what, we know Bernie here in Vermont. He's walked our picket lines. He's been a friend of ours for decades. He has not wavered in his support for organized labor. And frankly, he has mass appeal. And if all of the Democratic Party, the entire establishment who loves to get behind the capitalist class, if they did not come together right around the time, the last presidential election where the primary in South Carolina was taking place, if they did not coalesce around Joe Biden and put all their resources and dirty tricks into defeating him, he very well could be president today. So of course, socialism, or the notion of socialism, is on the rise in this country. Now, I might take a slightly different approach than some folks identify as socialists. I think I'm more of a libertarian socialist as such, right? But to each their own. And I think one of the problems is with socialism is, or with the notions on the left, that folks tend to get way too caught up in the ideology. I think knowing the history is important, but getting too caught up in trying to figure out the most pure notion of how to articulate a political program, which is perfect. I'm less concerned with that and more concerned with making sure everyone's kids have healthcare, making sure that everybody has dignity on the job, making sure that everybody has paid family medical leave, right? These things like this. And if we ever get to a utopian place where all that shit's taken care of, then I would be happy to sit down and have a good, long ideological debate about what the most correct terms or ideological approach is among the plethora of currently divided socialist notions.
I want to thank you for joining us on our show, David, and look forward to further political developments, working class unity in the United States that can lead to the defense of workers here and the defense of workers around the world. So thanks for joining us on our show.
Great, Steve. Take care in solidarity.